PaulaGloria, and this show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. Today we have a show that's going to be very important to me, and that is Christianity and binary economics. I was delighted when I found out that Robert Ashford is not only a professor of law at Syracuse University and graduated with tremendous honors from Harvard, and it comes from an academic family, and is a musician, but he also has a profound interest and faith in Christianity. And the idea of mixing Christianity into economics is something that is right down my line. So thank you, Robert, for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here once again. I'm very grateful for the attention you give this subject.
Thanks. So how do you want to start?
Well, maybe we should just start by at least reminding the listeners, if they haven't heard about it before, just to a little bit about binary economics, and then maybe we could move into the relationship to Christianity. I always start, as you've here, to put this little diagram on the board and ask the viewer to look at what they see in that. And typically, people see a couple of faces. That's almost the first thing we see. But then if you look closely, you could say, well, it could be a vase instead of the two faces. And if you could imagine showing that diagram to a society that never had pottery, all they'd see is the vases. They just wouldn't see the face. They wouldn't see the vase. They'd see the faces. And so there's kind of an aha experience that has to do with starting at looking at something with a preconception, and then moving to an alternative way of looking at something. And often that's very very difficult when we have no experience. Well, the binary view of economics is kind of that sort of notion. Adam Smith thought that capital, and that's what everything that's non-human that we use in production, not financial capital, that's another sort of thing in the confusion, but real capital, machines, tools, structures, land is capital, anything that can be owned and is used in the production process. He thought capital made labor more productive. So it's very what we call homocentric. You dig a hole in 4 hours by hand, 1 hour with a shovel, or you saw 10 boards with a hand saw and 100 boards an hour with a machine saw. We always look at it that we're becoming more productive. But the binary economist says, well, actually, if you think about it, the machine might be doing more and more of the work, and the role of the machine or the capital is to relieve us of toil. So we look at the Industrial Revolution and all the wonderful growth that's come, and some of the terrible growth that's come, as being like this. You haul a sack a mile and you're exhausted, but you put 10 sacks on a horse and go twice as far in half the time. Now the horse, which is a magnificent creature, is actually in the economic world capital. It can be owned and it can be used in production. And we think the horse does much more than simply make the person more productive. The horse is doing most of the extra work. And when you put like 1,000 sacks on a truck, start up the truck, and you do maybe 50,000 sack miles worth of work, take 50,000 sacks a mile, in the time that one poor person would have been exhausted, we see the truck is doing most of the extra work. So that vase between the face for the binary economist is the idea that capital doesn't make labor more productive. You could look at it that way, but the most important thing is that capital is doing more and more of the work, and the whole function of invention is to shift work from the human to the non-human. And that's the basic principle in binary economics. And it may sound funny, but from Adam Smith to this guy named Ricardo to Karl Marx, who didn't reject Adam Smith's analysis, he just said that we had to deal with issues like class structure and power. Alfred Marshall, who brought us neoclassical economics, that's kind of the economics of the Republican Party, he had that ideology. In Keynesian economics, that's kind of the economics of the Democratic Party, where the government gets involved in managing demand. All those approaches, Friedman and Galbraith, which are modern economists, they all look at capital as making labor more productive. And we binary economists think that just misses the point. Capital is doing most of the work. And so just to try to give us the thumbnail, once you see capital as being independently productive, that is, it does its own work. It may take the person to lead the horse, but it also would take the person to lead 10 people hauling sacks. So leading is not the work of hauling. Once you see the capital is doing its own work, then you see that compared to 100 or 200 years ago, capital does many, many things. It replaces labor. It vastly supplements labor. You almost never simply replace a labor thing that does work with a capital thing that does work and just get the same work. You almost get vastly amounts more work. You can't haul as much with humans as you can with horses. You can't lift as much with people as you can with elevators. You can't calculate as fast within your head as with a calculator or a computer. Anytime you use capital, it gets vastly more production. And then the third thing that capital does is capital does work that labor never does. I love to tell people that a farmer never grew an apple. Right. All a farmer can do is up a tree, grow an apple. If a farmer doesn't grow an apple, that's not substituting capital for labor. Farmers never grew apples. And so, too, we can't fly. There's no substitution of capital and labor. We can't even we marvel at the computer revolution. We can't make a single computer chip because our hands are too big. So capital does tons of work. People think of technology creating more jobs for labor, but the truth is technology creates a lot more jobs for capital than it does for labor. And you may think of technology making people more productive, but it takes the machines much, much more productive. So capital is doing most of the work, and that leads to the recognition that in an industrial economy, capital has to be broadly owned. It can't be narrowly owned. By the way, the fourth thing that capital does is capital works without labor. Try living without your washing machine, or think of the times when you hit the print button on your computer and you go off and have a cup of coffee. There's so many things that capital does without us, really, the automatic teller. So we believe that, and then we also believe, we binary economists believe that the reason we have vast unused capacity, we could feed and clothe and shelter the world much more easily than 100 years ago. The reason we have this capacity and don't use it is because ownership is concentrated. And we come to the recognition that if everybody could acquire capital with the earnings of capital, that's what we call the binary property right, if everybody could acquire capital with the earnings of capital, then we would have significant growth. We would employ unused capacity, and we would promote growth, because the demand for, market demand for capital instrument today is because of the things it will produce tomorrow. A capital instrument doesn't produce until it's built and employed. And so the broader distribution of ownership in the future will soak up unused capacity in the present, and will lead to the profitable employment of our existing capacity and to more growth. So we're making a mistake. We're trying to solve the income distribution problem in an industrial economy with jobs and welfare. But when capital is producing most of the work and can buy itself, literally pay for itself, on the promise of its future income, that process can be universalized. Right now, only the rich get to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, not the poor. And I see, Paula, you put a wonderful chart on the board that shows, on the left little thing, that shows one person hauling a sack. In the middle one, it shows doing it with a donkey, where the donkey is doing so much more of the work. And in the last one, you see this broken graph because it's so big you couldn't even squeeze it in, where the truck is doing most of the work. That's the kind of growth. If you look at what we were doing in 1776, 1876, 1976 until today, and the viewer can get a sense. You've seen movies about the Revolutionary War, saw what they were producing then. You've seen movies about the Civil War. That's a good, approximation. Right. And you see movies about in the Great Depression in the 1930s, and then the 1980s, and what we got today. We're producing vast amounts, but we could produce much more, and in much greener ways if we had broad ownership. The funniest thing, that the 20th century, they call this thing the Cold War, and it actually started way back in 1903 when the first communist revolutions were attempted in Russia. Then they had the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. Then we had all the way, we did have this Nazi interlude, but that was a relatively short period of time. Then we had the Cold War, and then finally 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. All that was a war over a Cold War and sometimes a hot war over the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. So ladies and gentlemen that are listening to this, think there's a right that the rich have, and that is they can acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Now, theoretically, everybody can do it, but practically only existing owners can do it. And that was a right that was so important that the West was willing to go to nuclear war over. And the communists were outlawing that right. They said nobody should be able to acquire capital with the earnings of capital except the government. And the binary economists say both ideas wrong. The government shouldn't monopolize the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, but nor should the few. Everybody should be able to participate in that process, and they can. Capital that buys itself for the rich can buy itself even more profitably and more extensively and more bountifully if everybody could acquire capital with the earnings of capital. And after capital buys itself, it will distribute an income which will support consumer demand for all the goods and services we could make right now but don't make right now. So that's kind of the thumbnail of binary economics.
And you've gone over that so nicely, and it's so important to keep going over it. But I'm wondering, since technology is rather recent in our human history, how can it be that 2,000 years ago, Jesus Christ was saying something that could be relevant to what you're saying? Because you're thinking of the Depression and and communism and private property being demonized. How is it that something was maybe missed 2,000 years ago and thus we weren't prepared to handle really wealth?
Well, it's interesting we asked that question. It seems pretty obvious, and even if we were just to put economics aside for a second, it's pretty obvious to me that whether you think of Jesus as being the divine Son of God, uniquely begotten, etc., or whether you just accept him for what he is, as you know, I call the red words in the Bible. Some Bibles have his words in red. Whatever you say, his words are so obviously relevant today, not only in economics but in 1,000 ways. I'll say one thing that seems to be relatively unique about Jesus, although there may be others, I don't know. Almost every other founder of a major religion that exists today was either very wealthy, connected with the crown, or connected with an army, or connected with some established, was the darling of some established faith. We don't. Jesus had none of those connections, and yet his words uniquely survive and provide guidance for so many people. So I would say the other way around. I love your perspective, but it would be funny if Jesus' words didn't have some marvelous connection to economics, and it would be funny. It would be unusual if he couldn't enlighten almost any sort of application, because his words seem so timeless. And that's just looking at his words. It's not giving him the credit of being the Son of God or not. I mean, that is an article of faith. But just looking at his words. So I began to, after I had mastered binary economics, I began to look around for ways of teaching it to people, not only by it itself, but other ways. And Paula, we should say, by the way, that the idea that a faith in Christianity would lead people to prefer binary economics over other forms of economics doesn't mean that a faith in the Muslim faith or the Jewish faith wouldn't lead, or the Buddhist faith would lead to the same conclusion. Right. There's a wonderful man, you may want to have him on your show, named Sidney Greenfield, who's Jewish. And about 3 or 4 years ago, I had met him before that through Harold Channer, but about 3 or 4 years ago, he came to an event, and he said, a light really went on. I see binary economics is really a huge idea. And you always know when someone understands binary economics because they begin behaving differently. Right. Just you can see it. There's suddenly, when you see the vase between the faces, it just changes the way. No longer are left-wing ways and right-wing ways he's very learned in the Jewish faith, and he could do a program with you, and he's written a paper about how faith in the Torah and the basic Jewish principles would lead to binary economics too. So when we explore Christianity and binary economics today, it's not to say that the other faiths wouldn't also lead to this. But I think it is very potent, given this Christian society of ours, for people to begin recognizing that Christianity, at least as defined by Jesus, has a very special lesson, more than one lesson, to give to those who are looking for economic justice. And it's a deeper justice, it's a deeper message than just, we should all be good and take care of our neighbors. That's a superficial. It's a valid and it's very important, but that's just the surface of what it is to understand the connection between Christianity and binary economics.
But you were when I was reading through your paper, it was like it was this understanding of private property as the key to wealth, and that the more wealth, the more ownership is shared, the more abundance grows for everyone. And that, maybe Jesus saying, my table is for all, might be something that would give some inclination or indication of this abundance?
Absolutely. Well, one of the interesting things about binary economics is that it stands for the proposition that if all people are included in the process whereby capital buys itself on its own earning capacity, if all people are included, we will have more growth. So the idea in binary economics is inclusion of everybody in capital acquisition produces abundance, whereas exclusion, that is to say only the rich being able to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, produces scarcity. So it's inclusion produces abundance, and hoarding, that is keeping it just to yourself, produces scarcity. And that's the lesson of the bread, of breaking the bread. When Jesus broke the bread, there was more, not less. His loving inclusion of everybody produced the miracle of more and not less. And in a way, if you had to say what is the fundamental difference between binary economics and conventional economics, left-wing, right-wing, and center, it's that left-wing, right-wing, and center economics stands for the proposition that if you include everybody in capital ownership, you will not get a significantly bigger pie. Whereas binary economics is just the opposite. If you include everybody in capital acquisition with the earnings of capital, the pie will get much bigger. And that's the essence difference, and it's also the essence of God's promise of abundance, which is Christian, and I think you'll also find it in the Jewish and the Muslim faith, and the idea that loving inclusion produces that abundance. So it's one of the principles that Jesus stands for, and that I think resonates. It's not the only one, but it's one of the important ones. You mentioned also the principle of private property, and this is one of the more controversial points that I make about Christianity. And before I do that, I think it would just be maybe good for your audience if I were to set forth what I mean by Christianity, because of course people have different senses of that, and then we could go into this private property issue. One of the things I did when I began exploring this was to say, well, there are many people who have different views of what Christianity is, and there are many people who have written about it and all that, and what would be a good common denominator that really gets it all as at least a starting point. And we could say, well, we disagree about some things, but what's a good starting point? And I decided that maybe the best starting points are what I call the red words. Some Bibles, not all New Testaments, but some Bibles have Jesus' words in red. And so you could conceive of kind of the core Christianity as being red word Christianity. Now, of course, there are those that say you can't take Christianity without what Paul said, and you can't take Christianity without the Acts, and you can't take Christianity without the letters. And I respect that view, but at least this is a core. And I would be very surprised if for those people who believe that Jesus is the Son of God, I would be surprised that needs much more than his red words to live by. So I did that, and I came up with these principles, and I just offer them to the audience. These are things that Christians said, that Jesus said. Well, the first two are really kind of the easiest ones, because he summed up everything in the Bible with two commandments: love God above all of others, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he specifically says that really is the whole thing. That everything derives from that. But then he said more. He said, forgive trespassers and love your enemies, who are after all your neighbors. Love your neighbors yourself. So who are your neighbors? Everybody who's your neighbor, really. Repent all unholy ways, because the kingdom of God is near. Pray in spirit and truth for God, all God's children. Accompany prayer with deeds that help people to reach their highest good. Use your worldly wealth wisely. Go the extra mile for those who ask, while never forgetting for the least of these. You know, the least of these is one of those important things. Jesus doesn't often say, if you don't do this, you're not going to go to heaven. He doesn't often specifically define what act, what failure, what sin, what failure might be that may mean you don't go to heaven. But not taking care of the least of these was one of those things. But so that's a very important point. He also said, believe in Jesus himself, believe in Jesus and the new covenant of grace. So he said all those things, and I take those as being the sort of the core of Christianity. I'm going to take a pause. I see you have a chart up there. That shows, the top line shows the growth that we have. Let's say we could put 1776 off to the left there, and then maybe 2008 over there at the right. It might even be steeper than that. And we see the labor work that's involved is probably not really bigger. We're not doing more work. Humans were working pretty hard then. They're working pretty hard now, those that have to. And there's not much. I mean, I don't think people, when the work it took to drive a covered wagon from Philadelphia to New York in '76 is probably a heck of a lot more work than the work it takes to drive a truck. You can haul a lot more in the truck. And the difference is not the work the person's doing. The difference is the capital. So you have that notion. But let me then, and we think of capital as doing most of the work, and labor as being the base. Now let me just build on what I said about Christianity, because there are 7 points that are worth building on, and they all, I think, explain some. These are derivative points. Some of them may be controversial, but I think when there's the ecumenical movement that suggests that all religions are the same, and I don't want to be so wise as to be able to entirely object to that or refute that. But it does seem to me that grace has a very special role in Christianity. I've read the Quran, and I didn't see any big deal about grace in the Quran, and I have not read the whole Old Testament, but I've read and listened, and I'm not sure that grace plays the same role, but there, but grace is a very important element of Christianity. And one way to distinguish, for example, Christianity from Buddhism, as I understand it, I'm not an expert, is that Buddhism is the karmic principle. What goes around comes around. The consequences of your deeds come back upon you. But grace trumps karma. Grace says, no, but for grace. Grace is what saves us from ourselves. So grace trumps karma. And to the extent that Judaism is sort of the eye for the eye, the tooth for the tooth, and you got to live by the law, and if you live by the law, you'll be condemned. Grace trumps the law. That's the whole point of grace. So grace is not the product of human effort. Grace comes from God. That's a Christian principle. So Jesus' principle is God is the source of all good, and human will produces good only when consistent with God's will. So the sun, the rain, the earth, the plants, the animals, not human labor, but it's the non-human factor that is really the source of our abundance. And human will produces good only if it's consistent with God's will. So you might say that the concept of grace is a binary concept. There's the human will, and there's everything else. And I think, again, that resonates with Christianity. The idea that all this growth is the result of human productivity, that we're doing it, it's a lot of hubris, a lot of pride in that, and that doesn't seem to to ignore the non-human factors that God showers upon us.
No, I really agree with you on that, because somehow when you usually consider economics, you get kind of agitated, no matter what position you are, a communist, a capitalist.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something about this peacefulness that starts to descend when you realize how close this abundance is, if you just could even approach it scientifically.
That's
so again,
exactly
I get
right.
back to the fact that was Jesus teaching us a science?
So you're right. So moving through these principles, grace trumps karma, and grace is not human effort. God is the source of all good. Human will produces good only when considered with God's will. God promises abundance. We were in Eden until we disobeyed. We had abundance until we disobeyed. So it's deviation from God's will that produces the scarcity. Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of heaven and everything will be provided. The other thing is God's will is inclusive. It includes everybody. The sunshine, God made the sun to shine in the good and bad alike. He doesn't say we'll have sunshine for the good and rain and darkness for the bad. He doesn't say we'll have rain for the good. And Jesus cautions, just because people have misfortunes, don't assume that they're worse than other people who've lived the good and joyous and happy life on earth. It's not our deeds that produce this, and sometimes the good suffer as well as the bad. That's on earth, but God will take care of things if in heaven. That's Jesus' teachings. So inclusion.
You know, one thing I want to say, because I've read the Quran too, and the Quran stresses surrender. And I think, you know, when as I said before, when you're filled with this peacefulness, when you realize the great wealth that exists in capital or in private property, and that if it can just be distributed, it makes you feel you don't have to struggle as much.
Mm-hmm.
But there
Jesus
is a
says,
sense.
don't be afraid of anything but God.
Yeah, but there is also a sense of being ready for your abundance too.
Yes.
So you have to have some attentiveness and some alertness. And I feel the greatest gift I could do with my show is to try to plant some ideas into people's awareness that they can run with themselves in any way they may take it, but to know that as bleak as things may seem, there are solutions.
That's a very important point, and it gives people hope. That's exactly right.
But sometimes if you say with the Quran, you know, it talks about surrender. Like, as I was reading through the Quran, I think a lot of people who aren't of that faith can kind of find it very authority-based. You know, you must surrender to me, says God. But in actuality, if you sort of take out the filter that, you know, it's just talking about a principle. It's a principle of allowing and of reaching the limit of the capacity that you have as a limited human being. Just acknowledging that. And it seems as though that is what prepares the ground for this tremendous abundance to set in.
That's correct.
Just a thought.
That's right, very deep. So, and inclusion it produces abundance. That is to say, God says that if we include, and that's the lesson of the breaking of the bread, if we include everybody in the process, we'll get more, not less. Hoarding,
Right.
Selfishness produces scarcity. Inclusion produces abundance. And I think that's, again, what fundamentally distinguishes binary economics, the inclusion. One of the things that distinguishes it from the left wing and the right wing, centrist economics that dominates the mainstream today. Now, the next principle, and this is, again, one that may be controversial to some people, is the issue of what I would call individual responsibility and individuality. Jesus promises salvation to individuals, not to groups.
Yeah, right. I noticed that.
Not to races, not to clubs, not to organizations, not to classes of people, not to friends, but to individuals. Two will be grinding at the well, one will be taken and one will not. Two will be in bed together, one will be taken, one will. It's to individuals. And we are to exercise individual responsibility. And then the Bible also talks about the idea that we have been given dominion over the plants and animals and the earth. It's our individual choice with respect to these things that determines how we will be judged. Remember, according to Christianity, we're judged by our deeds, but we're saved by our faith. And that's important. People find that as a contradiction. Is it deeds or is faith? Well, you only get saved by grace, by faith, but you are judged by what you do. And I would say that I teaching my students who were at binary seminar the other day, and I said, well, when you talk about individual dominion over things, what is the institution in the law that establishes individual dominion over things? And the answer to that is very clear: private property. What's private about private property is that individuals have dominion over what is private. What's not private about property is when the collective, the government, the state steps in and says, we're going to take this from you, or we're going to take that from you, or you can't do this. That's when individual responsibility and choice ends, and when collective choice begins. So I think that individual responsibility over things is a part of what it means to be human, and a part of what we're supposed to be judged on. When Jesus says, use your worldly wealth wisely, he's not talking to nations, he's not talking to groups, he's not talking to corporations, he's talking to individuals.
Right.
Use your individual wealth wisely. And the parable of the talents, where people are given resources and they either allowed to grow or not, those are all things that have to do with using your worldly wealth wisely. And so now there are those that say, well, no, Christianity is each according to his ability, to each according to his need, and they point to the time after or early in Acts where everybody gave up their things and put them in common. And
Right. That's correct. That's a confusion. Usually you do think about giving everything up.
But it's important there to realize that that was voluntary. It wasn't required. It wasn't like Peter was a government and began taxing people.
Uh-huh.
And there's a couple of interesting people, Ananias and Sapphira, who was a husband and wife, came in and they said, we're giving all of our wealth to the common, to the apostles, to the saints. But they kept half of it by themselves. And they were each struck down, first Ananias and then Sapphira. And Jesus said to each of them, wasn't it your property? Couldn't you have done what you wanted with it? Why are you trying to deceive the Holy Spirit? So that sharing was not a government sharing. It wasn't a majority deciding, we think that this is what the tax structure should be. It was voluntary.
Uh-huh.
And yes, we should take care of the least of these, but it's a voluntary function.
Right.
So I think the institution of Christianity very clearly speaks to the institution of private property.
Uh-huh.
Now, it certainly speaks to the idea that you shouldn't hoard your private property, and you certainly, if you're somebody who's rich and can acquire capital with the earnings of capital, you certainly shouldn't stand in the way of an idea that would allow other people also to acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
Right.
Probably
right.
one of the greatest acts of hoarding whatsoever. those of the rich that say, aha, we really do understand binary economics, it would let the poor acquire capital with the earnings of capital just like the rich. We can't have that. We need poor people so we can have them work for low wages. That's probably, at least by implication, one of the worst things you can do.
But Robert, what they would say,
afterlife.
But what they would say, Robert, is that Jesus said the poor will always be with you.
Well, he said that, but it's interesting that Jesus said that with two things in mind. First of all, you never know when Jesus is talking about the spiritually poor versus the materially poor.
Oh.
Oh,
I like that. I like that. Because you know what? I believe that a lot of the Bible has been changed. I mean, we could have that discussion separately. But something did not sit right with me when Harold told me that Jesus said the poor will always be with you.
Will always have the poor. But it's also, and there's two other ways to understand that too. The second one is, and although I think it is true that Jesus always used the term poor and rich to have both a spiritual and a non-spiritual dimension, it's also important to recognize that he was speaking to those people, meaning to say, and my own guess is even if we were to establish a binary economy, it wouldn't mean, because we are, after all, only human, and anything we do will fall short of the glory of God. It might be, even if we did have a binary economy, it wouldn't succeed in eliminating all poverty. And the third thing interesting about that is that he said you will always have the poor with you, but you won't always have me with you. Yet later he says, at the end, when after he is arisen, he says, and I shall be with you always.
Right.
So you can take these things literally, but you also can take them perhaps narrowly.
Yeah.
Anybody who says you've got to take the Bible absolutely literally, I always say, well, Jesus spoke in metaphors. How can you? I mean, the whole essence of a metaphor, of a parable, is that it's more than literal. And sometimes, and the point of that it's more than literal is that you can't take it only literally.
Right.
So yes, you will always have the poor with us, but he may have meant something different, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't always be trying to make things better. It may be that he's right. I mean, the world may come to an end before a binary economy is fully established. But this goes away. That doesn't contradict the notion that by loving inclusion, we'll produce more and more will be included in the bounty.
Right.
Those two things are not contradictory.
Right.
So, I would say that private property and dominion over things does speak to this issue of abundance and universalizing the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. A person who only has wages and welfare for his living or her living is not a person who fully participates in God's earth and what it has to offer, as compared to somebody who can both be the benefit of charity, can be the benefit of his or her labor, and can also acquire capital with the earnings of capital. So I would say that under those circumstances, again, it makes sense to open the system not only to the rich, but also to everybody. And again, I think that's the Christian approach. There are a couple of other nuances that I think are important to recognize. If we have poverty, and if we have those that are very, very rich and who could help the poor but don't, it's one thing to say, well, the problem is one of individual greed and immorality or lack of spirit, but it's also perhaps the problem of the institutions. That is to say, institutions that are not designed to be consistent with God's will not produce good, just as individuals who are not aligned with God's will not produce good. So it's fair to say that maybe the problem is not only with the individuals who are limited, and some greedy and some selfish, and some not acting with compassion, some not caring for the least of these, but maybe the institutions are a problem as well. And when Jesus talks about this how to do good, he continually emphasizes the necessity to work from a proper foundation. The proper foundation is one of those things that he is always very concerned with. Think of the rock on the house built on the rock, for example, or think of the branches
right.
And the vine.
Right.
That is to say, if it turns out that you want to do something, you want to build a good foundation, or the seeds in the proper soil versus the seeds on the road and in the thorns, having the proper foundation is correct and necessary. So if our economic institutions are producing abundance on the one hand, right next to poverty on the other hand, and we talk about poverty in the midst of plenty, but it's really the other way around. We have vast swaths of poverty and islands of abundance, isolated, rich islands of abundance. It's not little bits of poverty scattered around huge amounts of abundance. It's the other way around if you look at the whole world. Then we have people who want to do some reform, and there are a lot of left-wingers and there are a lot of right-wingers, probably more left than right, but there are a lot of people on both sides and people in the middle says we need economic reform. You can go to all these churches and everything. We need to do better economically, but they're not working at the foundation. They're working at the branches and the tree and the twigs and the leaves, and maybe some of them get down to the trunk of economic theory, but they don't get to the root of economic theory. Jesus teaches us you're not going to solve the problem of where left-wing economics and right-wing economics and center economics still leaves vast numbers of people in poverty and suffering and lacking the benefits in terms of the sun and the rain and the good things God has given us. You're not going to solve that economic problem by looking at you've got to question the foundation. And the foundation is that grace and the non-human factors are what really produces the bounty. We need that grace, and everybody needs it. And we need an economics that talks about loving inclusion, not an economics that's built on exclusion.
So what you're saying is we don't have a solid rock, a solid foundation if we're not thinking this through carefully.
That's exactly right. If we're premised on a theory that says it makes no difference whether capital is broadly acquired with the earnings of capital or narrowly acquired with the earnings of capital, if we have a system that holds to that principle, we will never solve the problems of justice and economic poverty and justice.
Now, broadly acquired and narrowly acquired, explain those two.
Well, right now, if you look at things as being either produced by labor or being produced by capital, and that each one has an earning power, that the person has an earning power, and the person who owns capital, like owns the horse or the truck, has earning power. Right now, almost all capital in America, in almost every and in every industrial economy, is acquired with the earnings of capital. Very little capital is acquired with the earnings of labor.
Right.
There's always someone who jumps in and says, "Oh, what about all the employee plans and the?"
Someone jumps in.
I'm adding those all in. There's a wonderful economist named Edward Wolf, who's right there at NYU. He has a Wealth Studies, and he's done these studies for years, and it doesn't change significantly. Taking into account all of those things, still, 1% own 50% of the wealth, 10% own 90%, and that leaves 90% scrambling for what's left, and most people are up to their eyeballs in debt.
Right.
So the point is that almost all capital is acquired with the earnings of capital. When the mainstream people say, you want to become a capitalist, work hard, save, invest wisely,
right.
A few people can do that, but that's not the way most capital is acquired. Expecting people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital and to compete in that process with other people who are acquiring capital with the earnings of capital rather than labor, expecting the vast majority to get their capital with the earnings of labor, while there's a pinnacle elite acquiring capital with the earnings of capital, is like expecting someone hauling a sack to compete with a horse for hauling it.
No, it's
Can't be done. Can't be done, ladies and gentlemen.
No, I remember when I went up to Vanderbilt's estate and saw the third generation, and the tour guide was going around, and you know how they said he got his money? Because he saved up all the tolls. He had a toll, a little boat going to Staten Island, and he just never spent any of what he saved up for the toll.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, you know, he had a toll. Means did he have a boat? Is that what he had, or is he?
Yeah, that's what I mean. It just seems like you get these myths that are left, and it's like you say, it's not built on a solid rock. It's not a solid foundation. The economic theory. We're not told really the truth of what's happened around us with those elite percents. And then when you are told, you get those kind of cults that says, "Oh, get rid of the Federal Reserve," because they get a little bit of the knowledge, but that's not solid enough either.
No, I can tell you, if getting rid of the Federal Reserve would serve the interests of the pinnacle rich, it would be done. But the point is that the pinnacle rich love the Federal Reserve because it does good things for them, and the same good things it does for the rich, it can also do for the poor.
Yes, this is.
You know, there are lots of myths that tend to confuse people. I don't know if you want to, just for a minute, put on that 6-box diagram. We won't have a chance to go through it all, but that 6-box diagram, that is the thing that people would likely do if they were to set up a binary economy. If you have that particular diagram, it's got 6. That looks like it. Can you move it over? That's the 3-box.
3-box.
That is actually.
Here it should be.
This one, that's right.
Yeah, I got it in.
Good, you got it in. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I don't think we're going to go through all of this. A certain amount you have to just take on faith. But I'm going to quickly go over this and then make a point about it.
But, you know, Robert, I can always link it to when you did go through it extensively. You might just highlight the Christian principles for this hour and a half.
Well, that's right. I will do that and simply suggest that what this shows on the box 1 in the top left are one or many corporations acquiring new capital. That's the little cross-marked box here. That's how they grow. They acquire capital. They almost always use the earnings of capital. It shows box 3, which is a lender. It's box 3. It shows box 4, which is a commercial credit insurer. It provides insurance for the lenders. That allows people without capital to acquire capital. There's a government reinsurer. That's number 5 down below, the bottom right. And there's a central bank, and that's bottom number 6. We hear how the central bank is bumping in right now to save Bear Stearns, and saves a lot of people, but mostly it saves rich people. Now those 6 boxes, and the new box is number 2, and that shows a trust that can acquire capital with the earnings of capital for poor people, for workers, for customers who otherwise can't afford products, for neighbors, people who live around the corporations, and even for welfare recipients that otherwise would be earning income be receiving redistributed income from welfare. Now, that's a system. The thing I want to say about that system, first of all, is that all 6 of those boxes, corporations, lenders, insurers, central bank, government reinsurance, and trusts, all those systems are right now used by the pinnacle rich to acquire more capital with the earnings of capital. And the same group of institutions, if we simply open them, according to the Christian principle of open to everybody, will produce abundance not only for the poor but for everybody. It'll make everybody better. Now here's the thing I want to say about some of these deceptions. You'll often hear someone, typically it's a right-winger, but not always, will say, rising tide raises all boats.
I use your quote a lot.
A rising tide raises all boats. With the idea that they want you to think about is if we improve the economy for the Bear Stearns of the world and the rich of the world, then everybody's going to trickle down to everybody.
Right.
And it'll make everybody better. But and then there's another saying that they say, it's a political saying, and that is half a loaf is better than none. When you bargain for something, if you can't get it all, at least get a half. So those are 2 principles that are used, I think, in some ways to deceive people. And here's what I want to say about those two things. Yes, a rising tide raises all boats, but you need a boat.
Right.
Without the boat, the rising tide, you're going to drown.
Right.
And the boat is capital. The boat is the non-human factor of production. It does the floating instead of you gasping for breath hanging onto a log somewhere, soaking wet. So you need a boat.
Right.
And then the second principle, and these 6 boxes are the boat. That's the boat. That's what you need. You don't need a single box less. You need all 6 of them. And then
Right.
the second thing is I want to say is that although a half a loaf is better than none, a half a boat is not much better than none. A half a
Right.
boat, you're just hanging on logs, soaking wet until you finally starve to death. But when you got a boat, then you can be dry and you can catch fish and you can eat and you can live. You need the boat and you need the whole boat.
You know, I thought of your analogy yesterday when someone said there's nothing wrong with a worm in your apple as long as it's not half a worm.
That's right. That's right. What's the worst thing? What's worse than biting into an apple and finding a worm? Biting into an apple and finding a half a worm. Right. Very cute.
But so what you're saying is that you can't miss out on this reinsurer.
That's right. You
There's
need the
no way this will
and you
work.
need the function of the central. You need the central bank to protect the private property of poor people, just like the central bank right now is quite willing to protect the private property of rich people. You need all of those things, and you need a proper understanding. And when Jesus says the house on the rock, the seeds in the soil, and the branches connected to the vine, you have to go to the foundation. This is the minimal foundation that the rich insist upon, and they're right. But the poor need the same foundation. They shouldn't have any less. And we can open this system to everybody without taking a penny worth of property from the rich. We don't have to take from Peter to give to Paul. That's not the system God created. God created a system where Paul can enrich himself and Peter can enrich himself, and there's enough for everyone.
Right, right.
So those are the Christian principles, I think, that can be brought to bear in this situation. And they really summarize is that grace trumps human effort. The real productive power comes from the non-human factors of production, which perfectly obey God's will. We produce good only and abundance only when we work consistent with God's will. God promises abundance, but we have to first of all have our institutions working in a godly way. Inclusion is the loving principle of God. Exclusion is the human principle. Loving inclusion produces abundance. Hoarding produces scarcity. Individual responsibility, individual dominion over things requires private property. That's the institution where we can make our moral and spiritual choices, not only with respect to our body, with respect to our mind, but with respect to the things that we have. It gives us the opportunity to use our wealth wisely, and we need a foundation, again, built on a rock and then a proper foundation. So reformers of the world, if you want to reform, and you think you're going to reform by twiddling with left-wing economics or twiddling with right-wing economics up there in the twigs and the branches, and that's not going to work. Jesus teaches quite clearly, and I bet it's true in all the other faiths, that you need a proper foundation. And a foundation built on the notion that it makes no difference who can acquire capital with the earnings of capital is an exclusionary, homocentric foundation full of hubris and will never, I think, do the work of God's will. So that's sort of the story of this one. We could talk more about what can be done with this understanding. My own view is that in New York City, there are probably no less than 10 or 15 or 20,000 religious people that are working with interfaith councils and things like that, trying to concern themselves with poverty, that have never taken the time to learn this idea. It seems to me that if there's any of those people listening, they ought to invite binary economists into their church so they can learn this idea. The assumption that there's something important that we haven't learned is an important assumption. The idea that there's nothing new out there that we haven't learned and it wouldn't make a difference or you're not going to bother to learn anymore is an arrogant assumption. Most people who are working for economic reform don't expect as an important principle that they haven't learned that would make a difference. They just figure the problem is that people aren't listening to them. But in fact, there is an important principle, and that's reflected in binary economics. That's my story.
It does seem as though you need a teacher, you need a master, because we live in an environment where this is so obscured, and like we said earlier, often the Christian ideal seems to be giving away your property. But like you say, first you have to have some property to give away, and then it's your choice. It's a voluntary thing. But if you have no property, you can't even volunteer to give up what you don't have.
That's right. And to assume that that it's what you have to give, which is the systemic solution, is to ignore God's solution.
Right.
I think God gave us enough sun, rain, resources for everybody to live well. And
Yes.
if it's not happening because of economics, then it's the problem with the economics. It's not the problem with God. So it may be that a wealthy person with lots of apple trees can afford to give away a lot of apples, and he really should do that because that's taking care of the poor. But maybe what's even better is that if he learns the principle that everybody can have an apple tree, and they don't need to be waiting for the charity of others. The highest form of charity is to eliminate the need for charity.
Right. So again, in kind of conclusion on this part, we would say that private property, materiality, and particularly now that technology is advancing so much, need not be considered unspiritual or unreligious or unchristian, but that actually, through embracing these Christian principles of a notion of abundance that exceeds human efforts, is something that can help us straighten out our science, so that we have a solid foundation. We're building our economy on something solid.
But Jesus did not shy away from eating with the rich and having nice dinners, and he didn't fast. He was very, very, very specific on that, and he said that God wants us to have abundance. It's our problem. I think God cries when he sees the unnecessary suffering on earth. Certainly, Jesus cried when he saw the children of Israel, and he said, "How often I'd like to gather you up like a mother hen gathers up his chicks." So I think we can do much better, but again, it depends upon an institutional understanding and a proper foundation. And like you say, by including people in private property, then everybody can have the abundance that right now is enjoyed only by the few. But that doesn't mean that we may not have spiritual growth. It may be that if binary economics is implemented on Earth and people have many, many more material things, it may be all the harder for them to get into the kingdom of heaven because they're going to be all diverted by all these trinkets and things like that. Materialism can be a temptation. One of the things I say about material goods is they either elevate your spirit or they bring you down. One or the other. It's not much of a neutral.
But Robert, I think it's sort of arrogant for us to make the determination for another whether it'll bring them down or not. I think what I get out of my studies with you is that allow this abundance to come forth for all, and it will take care of itself. People will determine not to gluttonize themselves or whatever.
That's exactly right. I simply say we need to recognize that with these spiritual blessings and with abundance, it may actually test us in different ways.
Yeah.
It's just, this is not quite on the subject, but there's increasing talk about kind of scientific fixes that will allow us to live forever. Now that will really test the faith. Would you rather live forever, or would you rather end your life naturally so you can go to heaven, hopefully? So, that with the abundance of technology, we are actually tested in new ways. And you're right; it's an individual test. It's not something that that people should decide for us.
Well, I think we've brought up so many tremendous topics. I think, like you said many times here, to have the foundation be rock solid is better than to be having it on a sandy, shifting beach. And then, then we can decide about immortality and longevity and what technology is, and even this human machine paradigm. Because I think, again, when you go into private property carefully, to me, the idea of consciousness being everywhere means we don't have to be afraid or fearful about the intelligence of the computers. Once we're solid about understanding our own divinity, then we can allow it for everything else around us.
I think that's right. You know, it occurred to me that maybe the one other point that we didn't make that we were thinking about making in the advance is the harmony of this kind of thinking with the principles of science, and I think that's probably the only other thing that we didn't really cover.
Yeah.
Let me talk about it in this way. The purpose of a new paradigm, and I think seeing the vase between the two faces, or seeing that the Earth goes around, spins and goes around the sun rather than vice versa. These are new paradigms, new fundamental ways of looking at things. The purpose of a new paradigm is to explain, to dispel an illusion, or to explain an important anomaly, to explain something that you can't explain with the old paradigm. And the simplest example is that every morning we see the sunrise and every evening we see the sunset. It's cross-cultural, everybody sees it, but it's a complete illusion. The sun doesn't rise, the sun doesn't set. It's an illusion built on a false premise. And there was an anomaly. The anomaly was that these planets that they were observing, like Jupiter and Saturn, would be going in a certain direction, and then suddenly they seemed to go backwards. And what was happening is that the Earth was also going around the sun, and it's like two freight trains or two trains. When one's going faster than the other, you get the feeling that although both are going forward, one looks like it's going backwards. That was an anomaly. It wasn't a huge anomaly. You could still navigate on the Earth, assuming that the sun went around the Earth, but it was an anomaly. Now, with economics, we have two issues. We have, first of all, the illusion. What's the illusion? The illusion is that capital is making labor more productive. That's a huge illusion, and it's also very unchristian if you think that the purpose of us is to understand our place in relationship to God, and it's the non-human factors that is really producing the abundance. But the anomaly in economics, and I call it anomaly, is we have huge unused capacity that we do not use. Now I say that, and some people say that. Not everybody thinks that. In fact, modern economic theory obscures doesn't even talk about unused capacity. Right-wing economic theory tends to assume that we're pretty well near at full capacity. If there was a way of helping the poor without taking from the rich, someone would have done it already. If there was a $20 bill on the ground, somebody would have already picked it up. And there's this assumption that we're near perfect, when, of course, Christians know that anything human cannot be near perfect. We all fall far short of the glory of God. So the idea that we have perfectly competitive markets is purely homocentric. But that's the assumption. But I believe, and some people believe, and even left-wingers and some right-wingers believe, that we actually have a lot of unused capacity. If we wanted to feed and clothe and shelter the world today, and we had somebody who could do that, we could do it a heck of a lot more fully than we could have 100 or 200 years ago. We have unused capacity. Why? Why do we have unused capacity when people are hungry? Why doesn't supply create its own demand? Why is it that we have vast abundance next to poverty? Is it only because people are stingy and want things for themselves, or is there an institutional problem? So there's this anomaly. It's an anomaly. It's a confusion. It certainly seems to defy Christianity.